Prynawn da o Ogledd Dwyrain Cymru. Good afternoon from Northeast Wales. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I have a background in FET. I'm a product of FET and my career has been in FET. As you just said, I'm currently the chair of Qualifications Wales, but I'm not here in that role today. And I should just say for the record, the views I express here today are not my own and are not necessarily the views or the policies of Qualifications Wales, nor indeed of the Welsh Government, to whom we are responsible. I've got 10 minutes, so you probably looked at my title and thought that's quite a long title. Powering FET through collaboration, integration and digitalisation, qualifications as enablers for dynamic demand-led learning and skills. But hopefully I can do that some service in 10 minutes, because those are things I'm really passionate about. Powering FET, collaboration, integration, digitalisation, qualifications as enablers, I'll talk a bit more about that shortly, and dynamic demand-led learning and skills. So I'll do that by looking back a little, then returning to the present and then looking forward. So at the end of 2019, I decided to leave my job as a CEO at a large college. And one of the things I set up to do, I was appointed as the chairman of Qualifications Wales. Qualifications Wales is the regulator of general qualifications, that's GCSEs and A-levels in our country, and vocational qualifications. And the sort of things that were happening with Qualifications Wales at that time was very much a focus on the review of vocational subjects, making sure that the qualifications that were there were the right ones. And it was very much about developing this dynamic demand-led approach relevant to what business needed at that time. Another priority at the end of 2019 was developing new qualifications, because there's a new curriculum in Wales for 3 to 16-year-olds. And it was about developing new qualifications to work with that. And very much our approach as Qualifications Wales has been about developing new qualifications, as I said earlier, as enablers and not drivers. So what do I mean by that? One of my big concerns as somebody who's worked in education for many years and still does, is that within schools and colleges and perhaps elsewhere, sometimes there is too much teaching to the test. Sometimes lecturers and teachers are too interested in what the exam is at the end, so they just want to get to that point, rather than perhaps concentrating and putting more effort into teaching and learning. I personally believe too much time is spent on doing assessment and preparing for assessment. And I think some of that is driven by the key performance indicators that the government set. And an interesting book you may have read, but I'll refer to it anyway, is a book called The Testing Charade: Pretending to Make Schools Better, by Daniel Koretz, a 2017 publication. It's worth a read if you're interested in that angle. Another thing we were doing at the end of 2019 was beginning an agenda on something that I'm really passionate about, is moving from e-learning to e-assessment, but recognising significant apprehension and some opposition from stakeholders. And the final thing that was in our minds at that time was something that didn't directly involve Qualifications Wales, but an important development, and it links to Padraig's comment earlier on about integration. There's an integration strategy in Wales with the development and the launch within the next 2 years of a new council for tertiary education and research. And that's a new development that will bring together all of the management and the funding of FET and universities and work-based learning and apprenticeships right across Wales. And it's interesting in the work that I now do that the models of governance within education quality just vary slightly across the UK and Ireland. Lots of similarities, but some differences as well. And that was the end of 2019, and certainly as somebody who was semi-retiring, I was thinking that that might be a relatively nice way to spend the next few years. And then COVID came along. So it's been a very challenging time as a qualifications regulator, as I'm sure you'll know, and we've effectively had in 2020 and 2021 a situation where qualifications have been unregulated or minimally regulated, and we've just had to adapt in the interest of learners to do the right thing. And I'm confident that what we've done as regulators, working very much in conjunction with Ofqual in England, SEA in Northern Ireland, and with SQA in Scotland, is done the right thing. But that doesn't mean that there are real concerns about the impact on standards of what we've had to do in those 2 years. The other thing that was interesting about the COVID period, and we're still in it, of course, very much so, is that more people than ever began talking and thinking about qualifications, and probably lots of people now think they're an expert in qualifications when maybe they're not. But one of the key issues was fairness. And I think perhaps people assumed that in the past, the approaches to qualifications were all totally fair. But the reality is no system of qualifications is totally fair. It's about trying to make it as equitable and as fair as possible. But I think 2020 and 21 shone a real close light on that and has opened a really positive debate about where we go in the future. And again, I referred to a publication by one of my ex-board members of Qualifications Wales last autumn, as it happens, a book called Is Assessment Fair? How specific can you be and how apt? By Isabel Nisbet and Stuart Shaw. That's another useful publication that certainly I've enjoyed reading. So as an organisation, as a regulator, an independent regulator reporting to government, we had to adapt. And again, referring back to many of the things said this morning, we had to make a step change in collaboration. I think it's fair to say sometimes as regulators, it's very easy to have an approach where you're above all the centres, the schools and colleges, and sometimes seeing as the controller, the expert there. And perhaps there's been a big lesson from the COVID period, and I think the speaker just before me picked up on this. We now are really seeing the benefits of collaboration, and we've done a lot more at Qualifications Wales. So that takes us up to the present. Where are we going moving forward? Well, we're also developing a new organisational strategy, and there are 5 or 6 important parts of that strategy. The first one might seem pretty obvious, but it's really learning from COVID. Nobody would have wanted it, but there's genuine learning to be had from the COVID period, and building on that collaboration, genuinely reaching out, and we are putting in place more and more ways that we work with others, and I think that makes us a better organisation. Also really facing up to the fact that assessment really is a lot more than exams, particularly in the FET space, but beyond that. We all know there's non-examined assessment. It's been around for a long time, but I still think too many people see examinations as being the main part of assessment. And certainly if I go back to my experience in FET at the college, I've drawn from that experience of all sorts of types of assessment to inform my thinking and how I can contribute to Qualifications Wales. The other interesting one is around the roles of teachers and lecturers in assessment and awarding of qualifications. Again, there's been a far greater involvement of those teachers over the last 2 years in informing the final decisions. And we're trying to learn from that and say, where is the best practice right across the world? Because I think teacher involvement in assessment is here to stay for a longer period. And we've done some initial research. We've looked at models in 12 different countries, different models. One of them was Ireland, by the way. And then we've undertaken more in-depth case studies looking at Estonia, New Zealand, Ontario, Canada, and Queensland, Australia. And that's informing our thinking about how we move forward and influencing these new qualifications that we're going to develop alongside the new curriculum in Wales. Then I go back to the role of digitalisation and e-assessment. Many people are frightened and give excuses not to do it. So it needs an evolutionary approach, but it is something that I, as a chair of a regulator, am keen for us to play our part in and to move it forward. And that requires resource. It requires the right resource to take it forward in the right way. Finally, and it's quite a big area, particularly linking to FET, is the impact of COVID on the businesses and the economy that is served by FET. When I ran a college, my approach was very much about looking at how I serve the local economy and local communities. And we've only, I think, got to look at the changes in working practices to some hybrid and home working and ask ourselves, how does that impact upon what FET now needs to offer? The other thing that I think has happened over the last 20 months or so is that we've seen some new emerging sectors. We've seen some sectors grow faster than we had anticipated. And then in contrast, we've seen the demise of some sectors and the gradual contracting of others. So we need an FET system that is able to respond to that. So that's where the dynamic side of this demand-led system comes in. I think the years of where we think we can develop qualifications in 1 year, deliver them in one way, and they're still going to be acceptable in 10 or 20 years have long gone. And I think it's now about developing through micro-credentials and others new approaches, but recognizing that something you might develop today might well indeed be out of date in 3 to 5 years' time. And that's real opportunities there, linked to the environment and the future of the well-being of future generations as well. And then, so that gives you a feel for what we're doing in Wales. If I can just finish off by just quickly referring to the QQI strategy, and can I just congratulate everyone on the document. I think you've picked up many of the issues that we're dealing with in Wales and many others in Wales as well. And I have to say that having read it in preparedness for today, it's certainly something I'm going to make sure that other people in Wales see, because I think there's some real learning to be had from the work that you're now going to do. But I commend you on your focus on learners, on your commitment to engagement and partnerships through better information and opportunities for learners, and that important thing about strengthening regulation to protect learners. And finally, I think an important part for me is that issue around driving and stimulating provider development. One of the things I've done of late, and I'm still doing, is leading some of the reviews of the ETBs in Ireland, and that's been a really interesting process. And I detect a real appetite within the ETB sector for growth. And I think with the leadership that QQI is showing through its commitment to excellence and being a leader for that within the system, I think Ireland is well placed if you all work together to make good step forward. Final message from me, as a Welshman, it's always good to work with colleagues in Ireland. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much for the pleasure of being part of your very important launch today. Thank you.